Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here to share with you the 5 key components to a professional heavy bass tone. Now for this video, I'm gonna break down the bass tone that you hear in the intro of my videos because it's a question that I get all of the time. People ask me all the time how I achieved such a heavy, crisp tone. So what I'm gonna do here is break down that exact bass tone piece by piece and explain to you how these 5 key components come into play and help me shape the bass tone that you hear in the intro to my videos and on my productions in general. So let's check out the sample. Super quick, straight to the point, but people seem to really dig this tone, and let's see what's happening under the hood. So if we look here, it's a super simple bass mix. I have 2 bass tracks, a bass submix, and then a bass stem track, and then my master fader. Now, let me just say this. You see 2 bass tracks, but it's actually just one single bass DI that's been duplicated and is treated separately. And I'll explain to you what I'm doing on the second track as well as on the first track. But let's quickly talk about the routing first. So these 2 bass tracks are being routed to a bass submix. And the bass submix has a little bit of EQ, which we'll talk about in a second. And then my bass submix is being routed to a bass stem track, which is doing nothing. For me and my mixes, my stem tracks are just a final kind of master fader for a group of instruments, just to give me more flexibility if I need to EQ maybe my drums in total or my vocals in total. But in this case, it's not being used at all. It's just there because it's from my template. And then after that is my master fader. And that's it as far as the routing. There's really not a whole lot going on. Most of the heavy lifting is happening on the individual bass tracks themselves. And like I said, we have to keep in mind both of these bass tracks are exactly the same. They're not 2 different bass performances. It's not a bass amp and a bass DI. They're both the bass DI. But like I said, I'm treating them separately and in different ways. And let's see what's happening under the hood. So the first thing I want to bring up as far as the first of the 5 components of any great metal bass tone is the source. Now this is sort of a cheat because it has nothing to do with mixing. And like I said, it has everything to do with the source itself. So let's dive in and listen to what this bass DI sounds like 100% raw and at the source. Let's check it out. Okay, all that is my 1998 Soundgear bass plugged straight into my cheapo 2-channel interface, recorded straight into my DAW. That's it. No fancy bass amp, not even a fancy bass. But there are 2 key elements that come into play as far as how this source was captured that really defines the final mix of the bass. And that's the fact that I was using brand spanking new, fresh strings. I can't tell you the amount of times I've sat down to record a bass player in a session and he comes in with strings that are 2 years old. That is not gonna cut it if you want a crisp, heavy bass tone that sounds professional. You need to be using relatively new strings. Now, depending on the player, strings can last anywhere from a week, maybe even a day, to a month. It depends on how acidic their sweat is and how quickly they wear into strings. If your bass sounds like dead rubber bands while you're playing it, or the bass strings sound like dead rubber bands while you're playing it, you should really replace your strings, at least for an important production where you're looking for a pro tone. That's component number 1, use fresh strings. Component number 2, which people skip over all of the time, is playing aggressive enough for the production and performance. So many times people will send me their mixes and say, hey, my guitars just don't sound heavy enough, my bass is just lacking punch. And I'll listen and you could hear they're just not picking hard enough and they're not playing aggressive enough. You have to dig in. There's a reason why when people record pro records, the producers really pay attention to the performance itself and try to pull the emotion out of the player to produce a better overall production in general. And this really defines the mix itself, regardless of the instrument you're playing. So in this case, as you can tell, the performance is pretty aggressive. Let's listen again. And again, remember, this is just a plain DI with absolutely nothing on it at all. Let's check it out once more. As you can tell, it's picked really aggressively. None of the notes are kind of flabby. It's not like it's picked hard in one section and then picked quietly in another. No, this is a heavy little riff and it's got to sound aggressive. So number two, make sure you're playing aggressive enough. And if you're recording a band, make sure that the bassist is playing aggressive enough. Both of these things people overlook all the time, but they will make or break your bass mix, believe me. So let's move right along and see what else is happening on this main bass track. And just to clarify here, my main bass sound is gonna be on the track we're listening to, and I have a secondary tone, which is a distorted tone, which I'll break down as well. But let's rebuild our original bass sound. Up first on my plugin chain is just a stock SansAmp plugin that comes with my DAW. That's it. No fancy bass impulse response, no fancy bass amp necessary. It's just the DI going through this cheapo free amp sim. And let's hear what the amp sim is doing to the bass DI. As you can hear, it's just giving it a little bit of character and making it sound like it's being played through an amp. I don't really overthink the amp much because again, if the DI is captured properly, the amp really is not gonna make or break the bass tone. It's just adding some extra saturation and some extra color. Now on the topic of saturation and color, before I hit my compressor, I'm using just a little bit of analog saturation. And in this case, I'm just using a stock plugin in my DAW. It's not even an analog saturator. It's just a distortion plugin that I'm running in parallel. As you can see, my blend knob is set to 40% wet, but it's adding a little bit of extra character. Let's check it out. Extremely subtle. To be honest with you, I could probably just bypass this and it won't make much of a difference. I just like to make sure I add as much color and character in my mixes as possible, because when you're mixing in the box only with plugins without using any analog gear, you have to add that sound intentionally into your productions. And that's kind of what this is doing here, even though it's very subtle in this case. Up next, after my saturator, I have a basic compressor. And this right here is component number 3 that you're always gonna pay strict attention to when you're looking to dial in a pro heavy bass mix, is make sure that your dynamic range is in control. And the way I'm doing that is not only by using a compressor, I'm also following up my compressor after my EQ with a brick wall limiter. So let's look at how much gain reduction is taking place in my compressor on my main bass sound. Around 6 dB of gain reduction, but that's not all of the gain reduction that's taking place. Again, like I said, I have a brick wall limiter that's there to catch any extra stray peaks and to make my bass very, very solid and unmoving in my mix. And let's look at how much gain reduction is taking place in my old L1 brick wall limiter here. So as you can see, around another 6 to 8 dB of gain reduction. It's just keeping a nice tight cap on top of my bass sound and super solid and unmoving in my mix. So when it comes to your bass tone, make sure it's not lumpy and all over the place at the performance, and also dynamically within the mix by using compression and a little bit of limiting. Okay, now in between those two dynamics processors, my compressor and my limiter, I'm using a very basic EQ. And if you look here, I'm rolling off all frequencies below around 60 Hertz, all frequencies above 4K, because I found that anything above 4K for the most part on bass tones is just junk frequency that's gonna clash with your cymbals, and it's really just noise. There's not much happening up there above 4K that's in the fundamental range for bass sounds. And I'm doing a little bit of boosting at 70 Hertz, just a tad, just 3 dB with a very, very narrow band, and a little bit of pulling out of the lower mids and some of the harsh upper mids around 1 to 3K. Nothing crazy. But the big takeaway here, and this is component number 4, is to make sure you carve out space for your kick drum. Now, super important, when you think of bass guitar, you think of low end. You know, it's filling out the low end of your mix. But we have to remember, we also have to deal with our kick drum, which also sits in the sub range. And the way I like to carve out space for these two elements is I let my kick sit below this range. So my kick is sitting in this mix below 60 Hertz. That's where that's dominating. And my bass is sitting just above that. And then my rhythm guitars are sitting above that, so on and so forth. So many times people will think that they should be boosting around 30 Hertz, 40 Hertz on their bass, which is fine if you're using a very thin kick sound, but for metal, generally we want our kick to punch heavily. And by making space with your bass sound, you make room for these two elements that can easily conflict. Now let's hear what this EQ is doing to the bass tone. As you can hear, it's not doing a whole lot. It's just helping it to sit a little more nicely in with the rest of the mix in context. So now, that's the main bass sound. The second track is a bass distortion, but I want to show you something before I dive into the bass distortion track. Let's listen to the mix without the bass distortion track, and then let's listen to the mix with the distorted bass track blended in. So this right here is without the bass distortion track. And here's with the bass distortion track. As you can tell, the extra bass distortion track adds a ton of clarity, which is kind of ironic, to the bass tone, especially when listening to this on small speakers. Again, remember, small speakers, like the ones that are in your iPhone or tablet or whatever, are not really reproducing much below 500, 300 hertz. So because of that, if you want to hear your bass guitar, you're gonna have to add some extra saturation in the mid-range to help it be heard on these small speakers. Not only that, it helps the bass cut through on any size speakers. And that's component number 5 when it comes to building out a pro metal bass tone. Use saturation blended in parallel to help add clarity to your bass guitar. Now I know this sounds weird. How can distortion be adding clarity to a sound? But as you can tell, it really does. It just helps the bass be heard in a production, especially a busy metal production. Now the good news is this track is very similar to the main bass track. The only main difference is that I'm heavily filtering both before the amp sim and after the amp sim. Now you don't have to filter before the amp sim like I am here. I just like doing that because I like the sound of the amp sim being driven by a filtered bass. Hi, I just want to drop in here and say I apologize for the background noise. All of my neighbors are doing yard work at the same time. But the more important EQ is the one that I have happening after my amp sim. And as you can tell, I'm rolling off all frequencies below 750 hertz and all frequencies above 4K with a little bit of notching, just in this case, at around 900 hertz. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is I want the distortion to only be occupying in the very mid-range of the bass tone. I don't want distortion in the top end, and I don't want distortion in the low end, because this is more extreme distortion. Remember, this distortion is meant to be blended in parallel just to add to the original bass sound. And on top of that, I'm just using a little more distortion than I'm using on my main bass track. And I'm not using that extra distortion plugin that I'm using on my main bass track because it's just not necessary, because the tone is just so heavily overdriven in the first place. With that being said, I do have a significant amount of gain reduction and level control happening on my bass mid-range track just to keep it consistent and so it's matching with my main bass track. Let's look at how much gain reduction is taking place within these two plugins. So around 3 dB on my compressor and around 12 dB on my brick wall limiter. The exact amount really doesn't make or break this distorted track. The idea is that it's nice and in control and similar as far as level control to my main bass sound. So now these two tracks are being summed and routed to my bass submix, which just has a very small amount of EQ. Now I do have an additional roll off here, and that's only here as a precautionary measure in case any other bass track is sent to the submix, which is not the case in this mix. This is just from my template. And the same thing goes for the low pass filter. These are not necessary for this track, again, because I only have 2 bass tracks and there are no bass overdubs, but they're engaged nonetheless. And I'm just pulling out a little bit of around 175 hertz and a little at around 1K, just because I felt that once they were combined, it was a little too honky sounding. So let me bypass this EQ so you could hear what it's doing to my bass tone. And remember, this is both bass tracks combined. So as you can hear, it's just smoothing it out a little and helping to clear out some of the boxiness in the lower mids. So with that being said, let's once more listen to both of these tracks combined and in context of the rest of the mix. So there you have it, and let's just review. Component number 1 you're gonna wanna pay attention to is you're gonna wanna be using relatively new strings when tracking bass. Number 2, you're gonna wanna make sure that you're playing aggressive enough, or you're having your bass player that you're recording play aggressive enough. Number 3, you're gonna wanna make sure that you're using enough compression and limiting to keep your bass unmoving in your mix. This is gonna give your production a nice, solid low end. Number 4, you're gonna wanna make space for your kick drum by using a high pass filter on your main bass sound and getting rid of all frequencies in a super duper sub range, especially if you have a hard hitting kick that's living in that sub range. And finally, component number 5 that you're gonna wanna use in a pro level bass mix is a band passed version of the original bass sound, preferably from the DI, that's heavily distorted and blended in with the rest of your bass mix. This lo-fi distorted version of the bass sound will give your bass extra clarity and also will help your bass be heard on small speakers. So there you have it. That's the exact mix breakdown of my bass tone that you hear on the intro of my videos. People ask me about this all of the time, and the truth is it's nothing magical. No high-end bass, I'm not using a bass amp, no Axe effects, no Kemper, just a stock amp sim in my DAW. But to be honest with you, the amp sim has very little to do with it. It all comes down to the 5 components I've shared in this video. So I'm curious to know, do you implement all 5 of these mixing techniques within your bass tones? Leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your opinion. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things Metal Rock production. If you're interested in some Frightbox swag, we've got t-shirts, mugs, and a ton of other cool stuff on the way. There's a link below to the Frightbox merch store in this video's description. Now, if you dug the guitar tone that you heard in this video, you could download my free guitar impulse response Octapack. 8 impulse responses, 4 different microphones, 2 mic placements per microphone. You get 2 SM57s, 2 SM81s, 2 Sennheiser E609s, as well as 2 Electro Voice RE16s. Again, the IR pack is completely free and you can download it by clicking the link below in this video's description. And until next time, happy mixing.